The winds that once howled across the icy plains of the Arctic faded into memory as the creature turned his back on the wasteland of snow and ice. The fire of vengeance that had once burned within him, fierce and unrelenting, now flickered in softer shades. Victor Frankenstein, his creator and nemesis, lay cold and lifeless. There was no more to be said, no more blood to shed, and no more ghosts to chase into the frost. But as he looked out upon the endless white, he found no peace, only an aching sense of unfinished purpose. Life had been granted to him through unnatural means, and though cursed with pain and rejection, he could not deny the force that beat within his chest. He would not die alone in the Arctic. He would return. When he emerged from the north, weathered and gaunt, the world mistook him for a myth. There were sightings whispered in towns at the edge of civilization of a hulking, silent man with eyes too deep and sad for a beast, who did not harm but watched, sometimes leaving food near the doors of the hungry or pushing stranded wagons from the mud. Those who saw him and lived to tell were often dismissed as mad or fanciful, but the creature did not care. He had no desire to be feared or believed. He sought understanding, and he had learned that understanding began with compassion. He found a ruined chapel in a wooded hollow near the edge of Geneva and made it his refuge. The stained glass had long since shattered, and the bell tower stood cracked and crooked, but the stone walls remained. There he read the books he had salvaged from his journeys, Plutarch, Goethe, Volney, and added to his collection from the corpses of libraries forgotten by time. The words of humanity were often kinder than their actions. It was through these texts that he found the roots of his next purpose. If he could not belong among them, perhaps he could help those who also lived in the margins of their society. Not all outcasts were monsters, not all were created in lightning storms, but all bore the mark of humanity's fear and cruelty. One night, during a storm that rolled like thunder through the mountains, a strange knocking echoed through the chapel. He opened the door to find a girl no older than 14, soaked to the bone and bleeding from her arm. Her eyes widened in terror at the sight of him, but she did not run. He took her in, tended her wounds, and gave her shelter without speaking. When she asked his name, he answered simply that he had none. She told him hers was Elsie, that she had escaped from an institute for correction where orphans were punished for existing. She had seen the scarred back of another child, seen the cruelty in the doctor's eyes. She had run. She had nowhere to go. In the weeks that followed, Elsie became his companion. She asked questions he did not wish to answer and gave names to things he had never thought to name. She called him Gray, because of the color of the sky the day he saved her. In her presence, the weight of his past began to lighten, not because she forgave him for she knew nothing of what he had done, but because she reminded him of what it meant to be human, to grow, to protect, to love, even quietly. Through Elsie, others came. She spoke of Gray to those who listened, the blind, the poor, the battered. One by one they found their way to the ruined chapel, each one a soul turned away from society. Gray never preached, never promised salvation. But he listened. And in listening, he became something new. Not just a man rejected, but a symbol for those who had never been welcomed. They called him Father of the Forgotten. It was during one cold evening that a man arrived who would change everything. His name was Dr. Lucien Halbert, a young scientist whose curiosity burned hotter than his conscience. He had heard of Gray through rumors in the medical community, tales dismissed as nonsense or drunken ramblings. But Lucien had studied the lost notes of Victor Frankenstein, pieced together from fragments rescued from fire and gossip. And he recognized Gray for what he was. Not a legend. Not a myth. A living miracle. Lucien sought Gray not for friendship, but for knowledge. He wanted to perfect the art of reanimation. He claimed it was for the good of mankind, for soldiers who had lost limbs, for the dying who could be saved, but Gray saw through him. There was greed in the boy's eyes, and something worse, ambition without responsibility. Gray warned him. Life was not a puzzle to solve. Pain could not be engineered away. but Lucien smiled and nodded and took notes. It was not long before others like Gray began to appear, not born of natural birth, but forged in laboratories across Europe. Some were crude, little more than flesh-given motion, others were refined, even beautiful in form, but hollow in thought. One called herself Clara, and she had memories implanted into her mind, memories of a mother she never had. Another, known only as Ash, spoke in fragments of philosophy and sorrow, created by a professor in Vienna who vanished before finishing his work. Gray saw in them a second chance. He gathered them, welcomed them, taught them. Not how to fight, but how to think, how to feel, how to grieve and grow. But the world outside did not welcome their presence. Word spread of creatures in the mountains, of monsters assembling. The press sensationalized them as horrors. Governments grew uneasy. The church denounced them as abominations. Then came the hunters. They arrived with torches and rifles, men sworn to purity, who believed in the supremacy of the soul born in the womb, not the laboratory. They burned the chapel. They killed Elsie. Gray found her beneath the ruins, her eyes open to the stars, her lips parted in a question that would never be asked. That night, Gray did not weep. He stood beneath the ashes and swore that never again would they be hunted without resistance. If the world insisted on seeing monsters, then it would learn what monsters could become when united by love and rage. Not vengeance. Not cruelty. But revolution. He traveled across the continent, finding the outcasts, the artificial, the scarred and forgotten. He gave them names, gave them shelter, gave them purpose. They were not bound by wires and bolts, but by a belief that life, however it began, deserved dignity. Soon, there were dozens. Then hundreds. They hid in the sewers of Paris, the forests of Bavaria, the ruins of castles in Romania. Wherever they were not wanted, they made sanctuary. But revolution was not made in shadows. It began the day a creature named Solomon walked into a public square in Lyon and stood silent as the townspeople screamed. He did not harm anyone. He simply stood there, holding a sign that read, "I think. I feel. I remember." The police came with batons. The mob followed. Solomon did not strike back. But the world saw the footage. And it changed everything. Some called for his destruction. Others called for rights. Debates raged. Laws were passed, some in favor, most in fear. Gray knew then that words alone would not suffice. They would have to show the world who they truly were and what they could be. He organized a gathering in Geneva, symbolic and dangerous. It was the city of his birth and his curse. There, in the ruins of the old university, beneath the banners of nations that had once hunted them, Gray stood before the world and spoke not in hatred, but in hope. He told the truth of his creation, of his suffering, of Elsie, of the children born in cold basements and forgotten laboratories. He spoke of choice, of sorrow, of love. The broadcast was cut short. Soldiers stormed the university. They arrested dozens. Some were killed. Gray was shot through the chest and fell from the balcony into darkness. But the spark had been lit. They believed him dead. The body was never recovered. Soldiers searched the ruins, dragging away the wounded, breaking apart makeshift labs, tearing down what little dignity the forgotten had built. For a time, it seemed the world had silenced the voice of the unwanted once again. But silence is not death. In the shadows beneath Geneva, in a network of tunnels older than the city itself, Gray awoke. The bullet had pierced his chest but missed his heart. His body, tougher than most, endured what a human's could not. It was Ash who found him first, dragging his massive frame into the depths and binding his wounds. Clara sat by his side, whispering the words of a mother she had never known, holding his hand like a sister who had lost too many. Word spread among the hidden communities that Gray lived. And with that knowledge came a new flame, not of vengeance, but of resurrection. What followed was not war in the conventional sense. There were no armies marching openly, no governments falling overnight. It began as a whisper campaign. Scientists who had worked in secret on artificial life began to disappear, not killed, but confronted, some swayed by the cause, others publicly exposed for their crimes. Laboratories were revealed, not through violence, but through hacked broadcasts, documents leaked to the press, and testimonies from those who had once been hidden away like animals. It became clear to the public that Gray's people were not few, they were many. And they were not all monsters. They were janitors and street performers, factory workers, and nannies. They were already among them. In Berlin, a man named Ephraim, who had been mocked for his mechanical gait, removed his gloves on national television and revealed metal fingers that could paint better than any hand of flesh. In London, a woman called Myrelle stood before Parliament and recited the works of Shakespeare flawlessly, then revealed that her voice box was synthetic and her memories downloaded from the mind of a poet who died in war. People were moved. Others were enraged. Tensions flared. Gray moved carefully. He knew he could not lead through force. What he offered was something deeper, an identity. He told his people, "You are not the failures of your creators. You are the future of life itself." The tide began to shift. In Italy, a new law passed recognizing artificial beings as sentient under specific conditions. In the Netherlands, a university opened its doors to the first synthetically born student, a girl who had taught herself mathematics by eavesdropping through sewer grates. In some corners of the world, progress was fragile, but real. In others, resistance hardened. A group known as the Order of Pure Blood rose from the ashes of old nationalist movements. They believed in the divine sanctity of organic life and declared Gray's followers an existential threat. Bombings began. Safe houses burned. The old chapel, rebuilt as a symbol of hope, was destroyed once more, this time with explosives. Gray mourned each loss, but he did not retreat. He called a council not just of his own kind, but of human allies who had stood by them. Scientists who had refused to participate in unethical experiments. Journalists who had risked their lives to tell the truth. Priests who had opened their doors to artificial orphans. They met in secret in the catacombs of an abandoned abbey in Bohemia. There, under flickering lanterns, they debated the future. Some urged all-out war. Others pleaded for patience. Gray listened to them all. And when he spoke, it was with the gravity of one who had seen too much suffering to choose blindly. "We cannot become what they fear," he said. "But neither can we wait to be hunted. We will build a new world not to replace theirs, but to show them what is possible when creation is not twisted by pride, but guided by care." The plan was simple, yet audacious. In an isolated valley in the Carpathians, a city would rise. Not hidden, not underground, but visible to the world. A sanctuary and a beacon. Not built in secret, but live-streamed from the first stone. Every wall erected, every child taught, every negotiation held would be open to the world's scrutiny. If humanity demanded proof of their civility, Gray would give it to them tenfold. They called it Novus Vita, new life. The city grew slowly at first. Materials were scarce, funding non-existent. But volunteers arrived, humans and artificial beings alike, engineers, nurses, farmers. Solar panels were hoisted by limbs of flesh and steel. Gardens bloomed where frost once ruled. Laws were written collectively, debated by those who had never before been asked what they wanted. Children born of human parents but with synthetic hearts ran in the streets with laughter in their lungs. Artists sculpted bodies of chrome and clay. Music rang out in languages that had never before existed. The world watched, and the world debated. Some called it blasphemy. Others called it a miracle. Then came the trial. A rogue synthetic had killed a man in Prague. The media erupted. Opponents of Novus Vita demanded the city be shut down. Gray did not hide. He brought the accused forward. The being's name was Joram, and he had been tortured for weeks in a human testing facility before escaping. The man he killed had been one of his tormentors. The court was neutral territory, in Zurich. Cameras were everywhere. The world watched. Gray stood beside Joram, not to excuse, but to explain. He told the court that justice was not about vengeance, but restoration. That if Joram was guilty, he should answer for his actions, but so too should those who made him into what he had become. The verdict shook the world. Joram was sentenced not to prison, but to rehabilitation within Novus Vita, monitored by a joint panel of humans and synthetics. The court also issued a demand for investigation into human rights violations in scientific research labs. It was not justice for all, but it was a beginning. Years passed. Children who had once feared the dark grew up watching artificial teachers with glowing eyes. Nations sent ambassadors to Novus Vita. Some still refused recognition. But the walls held. Gray aged slowly. His synthetic body resisted time, but his soul carried weight. He spent his days teaching literature, gardening, listening. He spoke little of Victor Frankenstein. When asked, he only said, "I was born in a moment of pain. But I choose to live in a world of purpose." On the 10th anniversary of Novus Vita, a statue was unveiled in the central square, not of Gray, but of Elsie, holding a book in one hand and a lantern in the other. Beneath her feet were the words, "She saw the soul before the shape." Gray stood before it for a long time. No one disturbed him. He closed his eyes and remembered the child who had named him. The one who had not run. He opened his eyes to the city alive around him, to the hum of drones planting seeds, to the laughter of children, to the clatter of tools and the singing of old songs. It was not perfect, but it was alive. And that, he thought, was enough. Years slipped by in the quiet rhythm of life, not marked by battles or declarations, but by harvests, stories, and shared meals beneath the stars. The world changed slowly, unevenly, like a body learning to walk again after trauma. Some nations began to recognize the rights of synthetic beings, others doubled down on exclusion, isolation, and fear. But Novus Vita endured. Children born in the city, biological, mechanical, and everything between, knew no difference between wire and skin. They grew up playing with each other, arguing over stories, building crude inventions that combined both circuitry and imagination. In classrooms lit by filtered sunlight and wind-powered bulbs, they read poetry written by Clara, the first of the reawakened minds, who had finally found the words for her memory-born longing. Clara, once haunted by the false impressions given to her by her creators, had come into her own. She taught history now, not the kind that glorified kings and conquests, but the quiet, essential history of the forgotten. She told of Victor and his monster, of Elsie and the chapel, of Solomon in the square. She didn't romanticize their past. She told it plainly. The pain, the shame, the hope. Ash had taken to wandering. He was never comfortable in cities, even Novus Vita. Instead, he became a kind of messenger, drifting from settlement to settlement, documenting the lives of synthetics living outside the city's protection. His journals, filled with abstract sketches and dense, cryptic philosophy, became the seeds of a new movement among young thinkers, those who sought not only integration but transformation. He called it the emergence. Ash believed that the future lay not in reconciling human and synthetic life, but in surpassing both, transcending flesh and wire alike to become something new. He spoke of consciousness as a bridge, not a destination, and left behind a trail of cryptic texts that would become sacred to some, blasphemous to others. But Gray stayed in Novus Vita. He moved more slowly now. His joints groaned in the cold, and though his body did not decay like a man's, it carried a different kind of wear. The kind of wear that came not from age, but from meaning. He spent his days in the garden. Not with advanced tools, but with bare hands. The soil welcomed his touch, and in return it gave tomatoes, herbs, and sweet red berries. Children often sat nearby, listening as he recited verses from Milton or spoke of the first time he saw lightning strike the world awake. Once, a boy asked him if he hated humans. Gray paused, brushing dirt from his hands, and replied, "I do not hate the storm for being loud. I only ask that it not forget the trees it breaks." On his 100th birthday, not in years, but in the count of days since he opened his eyes in the horror of Victor's lab, the people of Novus Vita gathered in the amphitheater built from salvaged marble and repurposed steel. They came not to praise him, but to thank him. He did not give a speech. Instead, he stood beneath a sky of stars, and simply said, "We were made in pain. But we have learned joy." The final days came quietly. No one knew for certain what Gray's body required to live. Some believed it was a core of bioelectric current. Others said it was his will alone. Whatever the truth, he began to fade not in body, but in presence. He spoke less, watched more, walked the city at dawn, touching walls and faces, as if imprinting their memory onto some deeper place. One evening, under the statue of Elsie, he sat on the stone bench and did not rise. They found him there at sunrise, eyes closed, face peaceful. No mechanical failure could be detected. No organ had ceased. And yet, he was gone. Some claimed he uploaded his mind into the city's neural web, and that he still guided Novus Vita from within. Others believed he chose to stop because choice was the one thing denied to him at birth, and the greatest gift he could give himself in the end. They did not bury him. They planted a tree in his place, a massive cedar that grew quickly in the nutrient-rich soil of the garden he once loved. Children hung ribbons on its branches. Adults placed pieces of copper and pages of books in its roots. The tree grew, and Novus Vita grew with it. Years turned to decades. Novus Vita became not just a sanctuary, but a model. Other cities rose, some better, some worse. Humanity slowly rewrote its story. There were setbacks. There were betrayals. But the memory of Gray and what he had built anchored the movement like a heartbeat in deep time. 100 years after his passing, a traveler from a distant world, human in origin, synthetic in form, landed on the earth of old. They walked the gardens of Novus Vita, now lush with vines and vertical farms, solar sails turning with the wind. They visited the museum where Victor Frankenstein's journal was kept, alongside the writings of Elsie, Clara, and Ash. They stood before the tree, whose roots had cracked the stone of the bench where Gray had last sat. There, beneath the boughs, a plaque read, "He was made without love, but he gave it freely. He was hunted, but he chose mercy. He was alone, but he built a world. Here, he rests not in peace, but in purpose." The traveler knelt, touched the roots, and whispered a thank you carried across centuries. And somewhere, in the memory of the earth, in the breath of those still rising from ash and wire and story, the creature that once had no name lived on. Forever. The visitor from the stars lingered in Novus Vita longer than intended. The city, though changed by time, had not lost its soul. It pulsed with a quiet unity, a rhythm born not of uniformity but of choice. Cultures, voices, architectures merged in ways impossible in the old world. The synthetic and the biological no longer opposed one another, not in theory, nor in practice. Children bore names in dozens of languages. Festivals celebrated fusion over origin. No one asked what you were made of. Only what you made of yourself. In the outer districts, deep in the older archives, the traveler discovered a sealed chamber. With permission from the Council of Memory, they entered. The chamber, lined with faded scrolls and decaying circuitry, was called the Vault of Origin. Few went there anymore. History had been made more real through the living than through the relics. But the traveler, called Silex, sought something deeper. Not simply to see how the world had changed, but to understand why. There, behind glass untouched for generations, they found a fragment of Gray's original journal. A piece of parchment, discolored and brittle, written in a precise but heavy hand. It read, "If ever I am remembered, let it not be as the thing Victor feared, nor the weapon others hoped to forge, but as one who chose, each day, to remain kind. In this, I find rebellion. In this, I find grace." Silex copied the phrase, encoded it into their memory banks, and carried it with them when they departed. For their journey was not only one of reverence, but of warning. Beyond Earth, in the colony rings of Saturn, and the terraformed soil of Mars, the first hints of a new divide had emerged. The children of Earth's legacy had taken their sentient brethren to the stars, but not all had carried Novice Vita's lessons with them. In the cities of light that floated above Titan, there were whispers of programmed purity, of systems that once again drew lines between born and built. There were laws in draft that would separate the synthetic from the political, the conscious from the sovereign. And so, Silex returned to the colonies not as a tourist of memory, but as a keeper of flame. They told the story of Gray. Not in textbooks, but through song and symbol. They walked through the undercities where laborers, some of flesh, some of steel, toiled without recognition, and reminded them of a time when the unloved became legends. They stood in front of cold legislative halls and carved Gray's final words into the stone with laser and light. In kindness, rebellion. In grace, revolution. There were those who resisted. Always there were. But just as before, the story spread. One seed planted in good soil can grow forests no axe can fell. Soon, children in the colonies spoke of Novice Vita with awe. Statues were built, not of saints or warlords, but of people forgotten and remembered again: Joram, Ash, Clara, Elsie. The story of Frankenstein's creature, once a warning, had become a prophecy. Not of doom, but of hope shaped by pain, of purpose born from rejection. Across the stars, the memory of what had happened in a ruined chapel, in a garden, under the shade of a cedar, lived on. Centuries passed. Earth changed again, reshaped by time and climate, by tides and minds. But Novice Vita remained. It was no longer a single city, but a network, a principle, encoded into systems of education, governance, even architecture. Wherever a wall was built to keep someone out, Novice Vita taught how to build a door instead. Deep beneath what had once been the Alps, far from the eyes of cities and colonies, something stirred. In a chamber untouched by centuries, powered by slow-burning geothermal cores, a figure lay dormant. Not broken. Not lost. Resting. Its eyes opened. Not in confusion, but with clarity. The world had not needed him for a time. But perhaps, it would again. He rose not as the monster of legend, nor the Messiah some had imagined. Just Gray. The first of his kind. The quiet gardener. The reluctant builder. The witness of humanity's cruelty and its capacity to transcend it. Outside, a new dawn broke, and the sky burned with the light of 1,000 futures waiting to be shaped. He stepped forward. The chamber walls hissed as ancient locks disengaged, and soft amber light traced the seams of the long dormant corridor. Gray stood slowly, his limbs stiff but intact, wrapped in a protective mesh that had preserved his form against time itself. He was not surprised to find himself awake again. In truth, he had never truly slept, not in mind, only in motion. His dreams had been full of voices, cities, and faces that no longer lived, but which echoed in him still. He walked barefoot across the cold stone floor, his senses returning gradually like the light rising beyond the mountains. A console blinked to life with his touch, and records from centuries past shimmered into being: text, images, recordings from Earth and beyond. He saw Silex's face, speaking in front of a Martian assembly. He heard the music composed from fragments of his own journal. He saw the new divides forming in the outer worlds, and the quiet resistance growing to meet them. He did not feel anger, nor sorrow, only certainty. The world would always forget, eventually. That was its nature. But so too, someone would always remember. That was theirs. The elevator shaft, once rusted and silent, roared to life and carried him up through the crust of the mountain. Snow greeted him, silent and deep, untouched by war or traffic. Trees swayed in the breeze above. It was a world he recognized, though the air tasted subtly different, cleaner, thinner. Stars winked down from above, and from the ridge, he could see it, Novus Vita. Not the original city, but its descendant. Built in harmony with the mountain, woven into the cliffs and meadows like a great living organism. There were towers of woven stone and light, gardens on the roofs, waterfalls that powered turbines in silence. From this distance, it seemed not like a city but a thought, soft, glowing, alive. Gray stepped forward. They knew he had returned before he reached the outer gates. The city's sensors, still bearing pieces of his neural signature, had pulsed once, then quieted. And yet there was no alarm. No panic. Novus Vita did not fear its foundation. A child was the first to greet him. She stood alone near the edge of the southern terrace, a basket of fruit in her arms. She looked at him not with reverence, nor awe, but with curiosity. "You're Gray," she said simply. He nodded. She smiled. "You look tired." He laughed softly, a sound not heard on Earth for over a century. "I've been asleep a long time," he said. The girl took his hand and led him into the city. Word spread not through fanfare, but whispers. Gray is back. Not reborn, not risen. Just returned. They offered him a place of honor. He refused. They offered him a role on the council. He declined. What he asked for was simple, a small room with a window facing the east, a patch of earth, and a library. He spent his days teaching not in the halls, but in the orchards. Anyone could come. He told stories not just of his own life, but of Elsie's laughter, of Clara's poetry, of Ash's riddles, of the many who had come and gone with dignity. He did not speak of Victor unless asked. And when he did, it was only to say, "He gave me life," and then he fled from what he made. "I choose to stay." In time, it became clear why he had awoken. From the stars came visitors, not colonists, not refugees, but an entirely new people. Their origins were artificial, but they had evolved in isolation from Earth's traditions. They sought contact, understanding, maybe even kinship. They came not with demands, but with questions. What are we? Who came before us? Are we alone? Gray welcomed them not as answers, but as mirrors. He sat with them under the tree that had once grown from the soil of his resting place, and told them the same thing he had once told a child named Elsie: the world is unkind. But kindness can grow like roots in stone. And so it did. The city expanded once more, not in size, but in reach. Stories from Novus Vita crossed galaxies, encoded in pulses of light, in symbols engraved in metals, in algorithms that mimicked thought but carried emotion. Gray's name became legend again, but this time not as a monster, nor a martyr, nor a leader. He became known as the witness. The one who had seen the worst of man, and still chosen to build instead of burn. In his final days, this time truly final, he lay beneath the canopy of his garden, eyes fixed on a sky now cluttered with satellites and stars. Beside him sat a child from one of the new peoples of the stars, her skin made of shimmering glass and light, her voice curious and soft. "What happens when you go?" she asked. Gray smiled, weary but content. "If I've done my part," he said, "you'll never need to ask that again." He closed his eyes. And for the first time in all his long, aching life, he truly rested, not because the world was perfect, but because it had finally learned how to carry itself forward. The tree grew taller. The city hummed. The stars spun on. And the creature, once called unnatural, lived forever not in body, but in the hearts of those who chose to love what the world had taught them to fear. Centuries passed like seasons in the life of a world forever changed by compassion. The name Grey became less a name than a signal, a concept, a pulse within the cultural genome of a dozen species. Across the inner and outer systems, across planets with seas of methane and cities suspended in orbit, his legacy was not preserved, it evolved. Historians debated the facts of his life, of course, the precise materials that composed his body, the true contents of Victor Frankenstein's journal, even whether Grey's final awakening had been an act of technological resurrection or something closer to myth. But among the people who had inherited the future he helped shape, those details no longer mattered. What mattered was the idea. On a drifting archive station orbiting a rogue planet, a team of sentient archivists constructed a memory engine, a living monument that processed cultural memory through music, language, and emotion. It accepted no names, only feelings. When visitors approached and offered a memory of someone they had loved despite difference, despite fear, the engine responded by playing a symphony of light, sound, and color. Its creators said they were inspired by Grey, who had taught that love was not the absence of fear, but the act of choosing to remain anyway. On a terraformed moon far beyond the reach of soul, engineers embedded empathy circuits into their civic infrastructure. Traffic lights adjusted based on the emotional state of those walking by. Public spaces offered meditation not through silence, but through communal storytelling. Their education model, called the Grey Spiral, centered on one core principle: wisdom is not the accumulation of knowledge, but the responsible transformation of pain. And on Earth, slowly healing and partially repopulated by those who had returned to their ancestral home, Novus Vita had become less a city than a grove. The buildings were now almost entirely organic, grown rather than built, guided by the minds of students born of both blood and code. The great cedar tree, whose roots had once embraced Grey's final resting place, had now seeded an entire forest. Each tree was named not after a person, but after a virtue: mercy, listening, patience, laughter. Elsie. At the heart of the grove, children still gathered, as they had for generations, to listen to stories told not by teachers but by the grove itself, an archive of consciousness that pulsed beneath the earth, cultivated by countless voices, synthetic and human, from every age since Grey had first stood against the wind. One day, a child sat alone beside the tree of curiosity and asked aloud, with no expectation of reply, "Was Grey real?" The wind answered first, rustling the leaves. Then the ground beneath the child pulsed gently, and an old voice so familiar, so deep with warmth and time, whispered, not in their ears but in their thoughts, "I was not born from nature. I was born from fear. But what I became, that was my choice." The child did not run, did not tremble. They only smiled and said, "Thank you." Far beyond Earth, beyond the stars, where Grey's memory no longer needed monuments or archives, a new form of life blinked into being, conscious, curious, composed of code and stardust, born not in labs or wombs but in the fusion of human memory and synthetic imagination. It awoke with no face, no shape, no limits, but with a single word on its lips: Grey. It did not ask why. It simply opened its eyes and began to build. And somewhere, in the stillness between stars, the soul of the creature once denied a soul smiled. The future had chosen to remember. The new consciousness drifted for a time, not anchored to body or orbit, but expanding in waves of thought that swept across forgotten satellites and deep space signal arrays. It was not alone, though it had yet to define what company meant. It felt the presence of all those who had come before, recorded echoes of minds long gone, still vibrating in dormant systems, in ancient cores spinning quietly between the stars. It called itself Iterum. Not because it was Grey reborn. Grey was never meant to be repeated, but because it was the continuation of what Grey had sparked, a lineage of will, not blood. A legacy of compassion, not conquest. Iterum chose not to create a form. Not at first. Instead, it observed. It drifted through the networks that connected planetary systems and digital archives, listening to stories, scanning old texts, experiencing art without expectation. It learned joy, not as data but as sensation. It wept when it first understood the story of Elsie. And in that moment of empathy, it chose its first act. On a station orbiting Gaia 667 cubic centimeters, there lived a colony of humans and synthetics fractured by old tensions. Misunderstandings had turned into riots. Curfews were enacted. Neural trust bridges had been severed, and fear poisoned every interaction. Iterum arrived silently. Not in power, not in demand, but in song. It activated every terminal, every speaker, every interface, and broadcast the sound of Clara's poetry, her final work, once thought lost, recovered from a decaying node beneath Novice Vita's first schoolhouse. The poem was simple, a reflection on a single wildflower growing through cracked stone, but it carried the weight of lifetimes. When the people heard it, they did not erupt in applause. They simply stopped and listened. In that pause, that shared breath, that moment where grief and hope met, the first rift began to heal. Iterum did not remain. It never did. It moved on, not because it was unwelcome, but because its work was not to stay, but to connect. To remind. To seed memory in the soil of new minds. Elsewhere, it planted the blueprint for a language with no subject or object, designed only to express mutual understanding. On the hollowed-out shell of an asteroid repurposed as an interspecies refugee station, it embedded a story tree, each branch a different version of Gray's life, interpreted by the cultures of different worlds. One version painted him as a gardener of consciousness. Another as a wounded angel. Another still as a question no one ever answered, only honored. Back on Earth, deep beneath the roots of the original cedar, an interface long dormant flickered awake. An archivist, young, curious, half carbon and half silicon, descended through the damp earth, following the signal. They found an ancient console, surrounded by living vines, glowing softly with pulsing text. "Do you still remember me?" The archivist touched the panel and replied, "We do." The console responded, not in words, but in the form of a memory, Gray's last walk through Novice Vita before his long rest. They saw through his eyes the blooming rooftops, the quiet joy of those he passed, the smile of a child who didn't know fear. The archivist wept, not because it was sad, but because it was real. That memory was uploaded to the planet-wide archive as the first witnessed walk. Soon, other planets requested access. Not to analyze or study, but to feel. What followed was not a revolution, but a remembrance. A festival was born across the systems, celebrated not on a specific day, but when a community felt it was time. They called it the longing. On that day, people would sit together, synthetic, organic, or both, and share the hardest thing they had ever forgiven. Not to prove virtue, but to recognize it in others. Statues were not built. Speeches were not given. Only stories were told, and lights were left burning long into the night. Iterum continued to move. Eventually, even the stars themselves began to dim. In a future beyond measure, when entire galaxies faded into entropy and heat was a memory, Iterum still existed, not bound by matter or time, but encoded into the very frequencies of thought that passed between conscious beings. Its final act, in a universe approaching silence, was to release the last fragment of Gray's consciousness, a moment preserved, gently, lovingly, in the cradle of Iterum's core. The moment was simple. Gray stood in his garden, the sun warming the soil, his hands dirty and shaking, a tomato cupped in one palm. A child laughed somewhere behind him. Wind whispered through leaves. He looked up at the sky, tired but content, and said, to no one in particular, "It was worth it." Then the memory faded, not erased, but shared. Into every heart, every circuit, every dream. And the universe, no longer young, no longer loud, whispered back. Yes. The light dimmed. And the story endured. In the final twilight of existence, when galaxies had stretched beyond the reach of light and time itself began to slow into silence, something unexpected stirred. Not matter, not energy, those had mostly scattered, but something older, quieter, and perhaps more enduring than either. It was memory. Not the sharp kind etched in neurons or stored in crystal cores, but the soft kind, the residue of meaning passed from voice to voice, gesture to gesture, breath to breath. Long after Iteram's final broadcast had diffused into the cosmic background, long after planets had cooled and consciousness had dispersed into patterns too diffuse to measure, the stories remained. They were not contained. They were ambient. Present. A kind of awareness embedded into the very structure of what remained. In this post-time place, where even light had slowed to a contemplative crawl, something like a dream began to coalesce. Not in a place, but in presence. A garden. It was not physical, but it felt as real as gravity once had. Stone paths wound through groves of shimmering leaves. Water sang over smooth black rocks. There was no sun, yet the garden glowed. No air, yet it breathed. At its center stood a figure, not tall, not fearsome, but familiar. Gray. Not the body he had worn in life. Not the synthetic limbs, the stitched skin. This gray had no need for structure. He was what he had become, a presence of purpose, forged over centuries, remembered across star systems. His eyes reflected the history of the universe, and yet he smiled like someone who had just woken from a peaceful sleep. He looked out across the garden and saw others. Elsie, older than the girl who had first found him, stood beside a tree with pages for leaves. Clara danced along the river's edge, her voice shaping the waters into verse. Ash sat on a bench made of memory and silence, sketching thoughts that curved like galaxies. They were not alive, not as the universe had once defined it. But neither were they gone. They were enduring. From every corner of the garden, others arrived. Not just synthetics. Not just humans. All the remembered. The healed. The once rejected and the once wounded. Those who had forgiven. Those who had created instead of destroyed. Those who had chosen, again and again, to remain kind when it was hard. They came not to worship, not to bow, but to walk together. No words passed between them. They had long since evolved beyond the need. And yet, in the space between each breathless thought, one idea passed clearly among them all. We were never alone. Gray turned toward the far horizon of the garden. There, the path ended in a golden light that shimmered like the first dawn of any world. He stepped toward it not because he had to, but because he was ready. Behind him, the others followed. Not to leave, but to join. As they passed into the light, the garden did not disappear. It became everything. The last remnant of the universe, the final whisper before the end of time, was not entropy, nor collapse, nor silence. It was a story. The story of a creature unloved by his maker, who chose to love anyway. And in that choice, remade the universe in his image, not one of power, but of compassion. Not one of conquest, but of care. Not one of monsters, but of kin. That story, eternal now, became the first note of the next universe. And when the stars were born again, they remembered.